Story 1. My son, Jake, has always had the strangest friends. I do not know why, but ever since he was little, he seemed to attract the kids who were a little off. There are plenty of stories I could tell, but there is one in particular that has stuck with me over the years. It happened when he was in the 4th grade, right after we moved to a new town because of my husband's job transfer. Since Jake had always been friendly and outgoing, my husband and I were not too worried about him making new friends. Things were going smoothly. He liked his new school, we were settling in, and life felt normal. The first time I met the other parents in Jake's class, I was relieved. They all seemed like good, honest people. But a few months after we moved, I got a call from the school in the middle of the day. They needed one of Jake's parents to come in to discuss an incident involving him and another student. My husband was at work, so I went. As I drove to the school, I felt a mix of emotions, mostly confusion and frustration. Had my son been in a fight? If so, I would need to deal with it. But Jake was not the type to get into physical altercations. That was what concerned me the most. When I picked him up, he refused to answer any of my questions about what had happened. That was odd. He was usually an open book, always eager to share every detail about his day. When we arrived at the principal's office, he asked Jake to wait outside while we spoke. Then, he started asking me the standard questions. How was Jake at home? Was he respectful? Did he listen? I had nothing but good things to say about my son. Eventually, the principal got to the point. Jake had been involved in an altercation with a boy named Ryan. I asked what had happened, and the principal told me that after recess, Jake and Ryan were the last 2 students outside, walking up the stairs together. Then, out of nowhere, Jake pulled an eraser from his pocket and hit Ryan over the head with it. Ryan fell to the ground, screaming. I was stunned. That did not sound like my son at all. On top of that, I had heard Jake talk about Ryan before, always in a positive light, like they were good friends. I asked more questions, but the principal admitted that no one had actually witnessed the incident. Both boys, however, had given the same account of what had happened. He reassured me that Jake was not in trouble, fights between kids happened, and no further action was necessary. That calmed me down, but I still wanted answers. Jake remained silent about the situation all the way home. It was not until right before bedtime that he finally told me what had happened. He said Ryan had tricked him. I asked him what he meant, and he explained that they had been playing a game, pretending to be characters from a video game. As part of the game, Ryan had instructed Jake to use an eraser as a finishing move. But when Jake did, Ryan suddenly collapsed, screaming like he had been seriously hurt. Then, he whispered in Jake's ear, threatening him. If Jake did not go along with the story and admit to attacking him, he would regret it. So Jake played along, and the teachers assumed it was a real fight. I was furious. My son had been manipulated. Instead of calling the school, I decided to handle it myself. That night, I searched the school directory and found Ryan's mother's phone number. Her name was Lisa. When she answered, I was surprised by how warm and kind she sounded. She told me she already knew what had happened. Ryan had confessed, and she had punished him. That seemed odd to me. Why would he tell the truth so quickly? But I was relieved that I did not have to argue my case. Then Lisa said something that made me pause. She admitted that Ryan had always struggled with his behavior, often pretending to be someone else entirely. He had seen doctors, but they all thought he would grow out of it. The more she talked, the more I felt sorry for the boy. It seemed like he was not fully in control of himself. Then Lisa suggested a sleepover to help the boys put the incident behind them. She even offered to host. I thought it was a great idea. That weekend, I drove Jake over to Ryan's house. Lisa welcomed me in, and we got to know each other over a glass of wine while the boys played in the basement. She seemed like a great person, and I genuinely enjoyed talking to her. Eventually, though, I had to ask about Ryan's behavior. Her expression changed, and she lowered her voice. She explained that Ryan had trouble making friends, and though he had seen specialists, they believed he would outgrow it. He was getting better, she said, and the fact that he was being social at school was a good sign. That was enough for me. Lisa reassured me that Jake would be safe, so I left. The boys were playing a board game and laughing when I said goodbye. Everything seemed fine. The next morning, I arrived to pick up Jake. He was smiling as he waited by the door, so I assumed he had a great time. But as soon as we started driving away, he broke down in tears. When I asked what was wrong, his answer chilled me to my core. That night, after they had gone to bed in the basement, Jake woke up. He was not sure why at first, but then he heard whispering. It was coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly open, and there was a flickering light inside, like a candle. Jake listened closely. Ryan was in there, talking, not just mumbling in his sleep, but having a full conversation. The strange part? He was calling himself Mr. Jim, and he was talking to his own reflection. Then, the candle went out. The room went silent. Jake shut his eyes and pretended to be asleep. After a long pause, he heard the bathroom door creak open. Then, whispering, right above him. It was not in English, and it did not sound like any language he recognized. Too terrified to move, Jake just lay there. Eventually, Ryan went back to bed like nothing had happened. The next morning, he acted completely normal. I was horrified. My gut told me this was not just a case of childhood imagination. Something was seriously wrong. I called Lisa immediately. At first, she laughed it off, saying Ryan was just creative. But as I pressed her, her voice faltered. Then she admitted that Ryan's issues were more serious than she had let on. A psychiatrist had even suggested he might have multiple personality disorder. She confessed that they had moved several times before because Ryan had been expelled from schools for violent behavior. I was stunned. Why had she not told me any of this before? Then she begged me not to report it to the school. I did not know what to say. Part of me wanted to respect her privacy, but another part of me knew something was deeply wrong. I agreed, then hung up. I told myself I would make my decision by the end of the week, but I never got the chance. That Monday, Ryan attacked another student at recess. The school sent out a vague statement, but by the end of the day, I found out he had been expelled. I tried calling Lisa, but her phone had been disconnected. A few days later, I drove to their house. It was completely empty. No moving trucks, no sign of a rushed departure, just gone. It did not make sense. They had vanished. That was years ago. Jake barely remembers it now, but I do. I still think about what might have happened that night in that basement, or what Ryan has been up to since. Story 2. My childhood was anything but typical. I was raised in a strict Southern Baptist home, where the existence of ghosts was dismissed outright, but demons? Those were real, no question about it. If something unexplainable happened, it was never a restless spirit. It was something far more sinister, something biblical. I never fully embraced that belief, but it was ingrained in me from the start. Denying demons, in my family's eyes, was denying the very foundation of our faith. My mother, however, was different. She was indifferent to religion, not quite an atheist, but never devout. Whenever I asked why she never went to church with us, she would shrug and say, "God and I have an understanding." While I clung to religion as a source of stability, she drifted further from it. It was just one of the many things that created a gap between us. I will not sugarcoat it. My mother struggled. Addiction, mental health issues, things she refused to get help for. Some days she was functional, even affectionate. Other days, she was completely unhinged. Looking back, I am almost certain she had schizophrenia or something similar, but in those days, people did not talk about mental illness the way they do now. One afternoon, I had a nightmare so vivid that it still haunts me. In my dream, I was lying in bed when my mother stormed into my room, her face twisted in fury. She grabbed my wrist, shaking me violently as she screamed words I could not understand. I woke up drenched in sweat, my body stiff with fear. But before I could shake off the dream, it happened again. Only this time, I was wide awake. My door flew open, and there she was, just like in my nightmare. The same expression, the same rage, the same words. It was as if my dream had foretold the moment. I barely managed to push her away, my voice cracking as I yelled for her to stop. Then, as suddenly as she had come in, she left. When I confronted her the next morning, she had no memory of it. She looked confused, almost hurt, that I was so shaken. I told myself it had to be a bizarre coincidence, some strange overlap between my subconscious and her unpredictable moods. But deep down, I was not so sure. A few weeks later, I heard her screaming in the backyard. It was not a sound of distress or fear. It was excitement. I ran outside and froze. My mother stood in the yard, grinning wildly, holding a massive, 7-foot-long snake in her bare hands. That alone was terrifying. But there is something you do not know. My mother was deathly afraid of snakes. She could not even look at them on television without recoiling in horror. But there she was, clutching one like it was a prized possession. "Come here," she said, motioning for me to take the snake from her. I shook my head and stepped back. "Mom, what the hell?" She only smiled wider, tilting her head at an unnatural angle, like she was trying to scare me. Something was deeply wrong. I turned and bolted back inside, slamming the door behind me. My heart pounded as I peeked out the window. She was still standing there, still holding the snake, watching the house. Eventually, she let it slither to the ground and walked inside like nothing had happened. When I asked her about it later, she brushed it off as if I had imagined the whole thing. "You must have had a strange dream," she said dismissively. She refused to discuss it further. But that was nothing compared to what happened next. That winter, my church hosted an overnight lock-in. I was relieved to go. Church was my escape. My mother dropped me off, completely sober, even kissing my forehead before she drove away. Everything was fine until around 4:30 in the morning. Just as we were settling into sleep, a loud knocking echoed through the chapel. We all sat up, glancing at each other. Then, the knocking moved, traveling around the building in an impossible way, sometimes coming from multiple directions at once. It was not the wind. It was not an animal. It was rhythmic, circling the chapel, as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. The pastor, the only one with a key, was asleep in his office and had not heard a thing. I ran to wake him, and the moment he stepped into the chapel, the knocking stopped. He opened the front doors and stumbled back in shock. Standing barefoot in the freezing night air, her clothes rumpled and dripping with sweat, was my mother. Her lips moved, but I could not hear what she was saying. She did not acknowledge the pastor, her eyes locked onto me. Then, a slow, eerie smile stretched across her face as she took a step toward me. I wanted to run. The pastor gripped my arm and whispered, "Stay here." But I could not move. I felt powerless, like I had no choice but to go with her. I climbed into the car, terrified of what she might do. But she did nothing. She did not speak. She did not explain. She did not answer when I asked why she was there. The drive home was silent. When we arrived, she paused in the doorway, staring at me, watching me as I walked to my room. I locked the door and lay awake for hours, listening. In the morning, she was in the kitchen, cheerful, cooking breakfast like nothing had happened. When she saw me, she gasped and said, "I was just about to go pick you up from church." I felt my stomach drop. She had no memory of knocking on the church doors. No memory of driving me home. It was like the entire night had been erased from her mind. I expected the pastor or someone from the church to say something about it, but no one did. Either they had no explanation, or worse, they did not want one. That was decades ago. My mother is gone now, but I still think about those nights. I do not know if I believe in demons anymore. The logical explanation is that she was struggling with mental illness, maybe addiction withdrawal, or maybe something else entirely. But the memory lapses, the eerie timing, the way she acted like an entirely different person, those things still haunt me. I tell myself there is a rational answer for all of it. But even now, I am not sure I believe that. Story 3. My oldest son started sleepwalking when he was around 8 or 9 years old. I had heard that kids sometimes went through phases like that, so I was not too worried at first. It was unsettling, sure, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. I have always been a light sleeper, so none of my kids have ever been able to sneak around the house without me knowing. That is actually how I first found out about my son sleepwalking. Most nights, I would wake up and find him standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes open but unfocused. If you have ever lived with a sleepwalker, you will know exactly what I mean. The way their gaze does not really see you. How it seems to drift right through you like they are looking at something beyond your presence. It always gave me a strange, uneasy feeling, and I never fully got used to it. Sometimes, he would mumble things too soft and slurred to understand. Other times, He would just stand there, breathing slowly and steadily, which somehow made it even worse. I would gently guide him back to bed, whispering his name and telling him everything was fine. He never remembered any of it in the morning. Then, a few months after I realized he was sleepwalking, things escalated. One night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, like the slow drip of water onto glass, except it was not raining outside. At first, I thought it was just part of a dream, some distant noise my half-asleep mind had misinterpreted. But as I lay there, the tapping continued, steady, deliberate, never changing in volume. It was too precise to be the house settling or the wind outside. Realizing it was not going to stop, I reluctantly got out of bed to check. My husband was fast asleep, and I did not want to wake him. I was more curious than scared at that moment, which is probably why I did not think to disturb him. Stepping into the hallway, I saw my son. He was facing the wall, his forehead lightly knocking against it in that same slow, measured rhythm. His fingertips brushed against the surface, moving in sync with the tapping, as if he was trying to push through it. I whispered his name, but he did not react. He just kept pressing his head forward, knocking it against the wall like he was testing something, like he was trying to step into something unseen. A chill ran through me, and for a brief moment, I hesitated. Something about the way he was moving felt wrong. Finally, I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a gentle shake. He blinked, took a step back, and then, as if nothing had happened, let me guide him back to bed. He had no memory of it the next morning. It happened a few more times, but it was infrequent. If I am being honest, I chalked it up to another strange quirk of sleepwalking. Maybe his subconscious had not accounted for the wall being there. Eventually, he grew out of it, and the eerie midnight staring sessions faded into a weird little memory. Until my younger son started doing the exact same thing years later. At first, I dismissed it. Kids pick up habits from their siblings. After all, genetics can be funny like that. But then I started noticing the details. The way he stood in the hallway, shifting his weight just like his brother had, his vacant eyes drifting past me, seeing something I could not. And then one night, I woke up to that same tapping sound. I knew what I would see before I even stepped into the hallway. And sure enough, there he was, pressing his forehead to the exact same spot on the wall, tapping in that same eerie rhythm, his fingers grazing the surface as if trying to feel his way through. I called his name. Nothing. I touched his shoulder. Still nothing. He just kept knocking, his small body swaying slightly, lost in some deep, unreachable place. And that is when it hit me. He had never seen his older brother sleepwalk. As far as I knew, he had no way of knowing about the tapping. His brother had outgrown it years before he was even old enough to notice. And yet, here he was, repeating the exact same motions. The thought made me feel sick. After some coaxing, I snapped him out of it and guided him back to bed. Just like his brother, he never remembered it in the morning. And just like his brother, he eventually outgrew it. I might have forgotten about all of it. Years passed. My sons went off to college. The house grew quiet. But then, a few weeks ago, my husband and I decided to do some renovations. The house is old, and we figured it was time for an update. New floors, fresh paint, little changes to make the place feel new again. It was all minor work, nothing too serious. Then, while stripping the old wallpaper, we found something underneath. At first, I thought it was just some backing or a stain. But as we peeled more away, my breath caught in my throat. It was a mirror. An old, antique-style mirror. One that had been covered up rather than removed. Why? I stood there staring at it, my heart pounding. It felt wrong. Like we had found something that was not meant to be found. And that is when I realized. It was positioned in the exact spot where both my sons had been pressing their foreheads all those years ago. They should not have known it was there. It had been hidden under layers of wallpaper. There was no logical way they could have sensed it. And yet, somehow they had. I got rid of that mirror immediately. I do not know if it meant anything, but I was not about to take any chances. Still, I cannot shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something I will never quite understand. I tell myself there must be a rational explanation, but deep down, I am not sure I really believe that.